Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colleen Clark, and I'm proud to be the CEO of the Greater Langley Chamber of Commerce. It's my pleasure today to introduce Sarah Forte and her presentation today on respect at the work in time of COVID. Sarah is an employment lawyer and founder of Forte Law with offices in Langley, Surrey, and Calgary. Forte Law has 6 lawyers and advises businesses and workers on hiring, firing, and everything in between, which these days there's a lot of the in between, I'm sure. Forte Law is an active member of the GLCC and has been nominated in an upcoming business award for our excellence in collaboration. So we look forward to seeing how that works out. And for that, it's because of a lot of the extensive time that Sarah's donated to doing webinars, updating information, and providing chambers such as ours and others in the Lower Mainland with some insights as to how to go forward through COVID. Sarah has also developed the program she's going to talk about today, which is Stand Up Teams, Respectful Workplace Programs. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, and I'm just here to help.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Colleen. I am so glad to be back. I was raised in Langley, so for me, doing Greater Langley Chamber events is always very much feels like a homecoming, and I'm sure there's some people I know out there in the internet land that are going to watch this webinar. So hello, old friends. I am really interested in this topic, and I'm so glad that it was interesting to you and your members as well. I think respect at work is something that should be on everyone's minds right now. I think sometimes businesses will sort of approach issues of respect or like people issues as sort of nice to haves. And I do find that these kinds of issues tend to get, I guess, when there's a budget cut maybe or a belt tightening, it's like, okay, well, do we really need to deal with this respectful workplace matter? Or is it, something that's probably maybe not a high priority? And the one thing that I really emphasize for all businesses right now is that, respectful workplace issues can result in legal claims. And it can happen and very quickly, and they become extremely distracting, stressful, and expensive to resolve. So if you're a business that's sort of just hanging on by the skin of your nails right now, unfortunately, one respectful workplace issue could be the difference between staying in business and not. So it's important stuff, even when we're talking about dollars and cents. And so I'm really happy to be here. As Colleen mentioned, I'm an employment lawyer. I appreciated your, hiring to firing and everything in between. There's a lot in between right now. There's also a lot of firing right now, to be honest. A lot of businesses and workers coming to us for advice when things have come to an end and wondering how things work. So it's a very busy time to be an employment lawyer. And the good news is we're able to help a lot of people, which is I'm really happy about during this pandemic. So I have come up with a list of questions together with the Greater Langley Chamber of Commerce that seem interesting and important. So Colleen, I'm going to let you ask me the questions in yellow, interject as you needed, and then we can lead through this topic.
So as we alluded to at the beginning, the pandemic has changed the workplace for a lot of people. So what are some of the new challenges or trends in the workplace harassment sort of arena during the pandemic that you found have come up?
There are some new challenges, and I think one thing everyone needs to always have top of mind is that stress is incredibly high right now. The level of anxiety, as compared to sort of a normal, like the before times, is really, I would expect if anyone took a pause and thought about that, they would realize even for themselves, there's sort of this underlying stress of uncertainty surrounding the pandemic. I think layering on top of that at this moment, in this month, is also the elections. There's the election in BC, which sometimes I think we forget about because we're overshadowed by all this drama unfolding in the US. And, people are talking about those things and bothered by those things. And people also have very strong opinions about politics, about masks, about, kids going back to school. These are things that people disagree about. and feel very, very passionately and strongly about. And so whenever you have these sort of controversial issues we're all sort of sitting in a soup of right now, you know, that's a time when respect at work is going to be challenging, right? The other thing that I'm seeing in my practice of advising businesses and workers is the difference in personal circumstances is really apparent right now in the pandemic. So, you know, if we think back to when the schools were closed, you know, people who had school-aged kids that, you know, they needed to be at home to care for, you know, people who might be older, people who might have disabilities, and, you know, are maybe asking to be treated differently than other people, or, and it's those kinds of conflicts also come into the workplace. And are things that, you know, coworkers will disagree because it might be that someone else is shouldering a heavier load or has a different schedule or has to do different tasks because this other person can't do these things. So, you know, personal circumstances are really adding to the, you know, fodder for conflict, I would say. And then chronic short staffing. So, you know, so many organizations are working short right now. And I find, you know, there's organizations on both sides of the spectrum. Like I have business clients who are saying, we're so busy, we can't, like, we need everybody here. In fact, we're working an extra shift just to get our, you know, whatever out. And, you know, example I'll give, which isn't one of my clients, but just to be generic, is like Amazon deliveries. Like everybody's shopping online right now. Like, you know, toilet paper suppliers, right? It's like, okay, we need everybody here because everybody wants the things that we have now, and we need to, you know, get those things out the door. So it could be short staffing, ironically, not from like downsizing or trying to do more with less, but just literally booming, and not being able to fill. On the other end of that, there's companies who've had to cut people or cut services or cut hours. And so maybe working with less people, you know, you could end up with people on quarantine or isolation on little or no notice, if they come down with symptoms and have to go get tested. And so suddenly you're working short. And of course, school closures. So, you know, now we've got schools open, but not all families are sending their kids back. And then now we're starting to see some, you know, classes get isolated again. And, you know, these things are going to keep happening. So, you know, those are all a whole set of new issues that we've never faced before, that people have to manage at work. And I guess, you know, for me, the pivot, I don't know about you, Colleen, but like, I really don't love the word pivot anymore.
I'm over it myself. I'm with you there.
I said at one point I started feeling like a ballerina, like I was just pivoting and perpetually spinning. So pivoting is exhausting. Like it's a nice positive term that we've all tried to use to talk about how we need to change and adapt to, you know, keep working during the pandemic, but it is also just exhausting and full of change and uncertainty. And that, again, of course, causes stress and job insecurity. You know, I find a lot of people right now are very worried about their jobs, and especially worried that if they lose their job, what it'll be like to find a new one. So, you know, I put at the bottom here, we are ready to blow in all caps. Maybe this is how I was feeling when I wrote that slide, but I do actually kind of feel like there's this pent up, like, this isn't ending anytime soon. Like, so I think all of these issues, people are coming to work, having these feelings, facing these challenges, and employers need to really be aware of that. And it's a time when workplace conflict, I think it's just the perfect setting for things to really get out of hand.
I think the most part, the one you touched on the most, is the uncertainty, because even as a CEO manager, somebody asks you a random question about, you know, 3 months from now, and you don't have an answer. The crystal ball hasn't been polished off recently, and it's hard. Like you want to say, well, we're going to do it this way, but we still don't know how we can do things and what. So moving forward is really hard at all levels. So that creates, again, that added layer.
Yeah, I totally agree. So those are the new challenge, I would say, in terms of trends. And these are sort of relating to the prior slides. I'd say it's these, like, we have these challenges, and these are sort of the legal issues that I see arising out of them. Discrimination is under the Human Rights Code of BC. There's certain personal characteristics that are protected, meaning that in employment situations, we can't treat people negatively, and we might have to make accommodations for things arising from these specific personal characteristics. The ones that are sort of forefront right now are family status, particularly for parents, age, particularly for older people who might be more vulnerable to COVID, disability for the same kinds of reasons. Political belief, I threw in there, which is, like I said, just like where many of our heads are at right now. And a lot of people actually don't know that it's a protected ground under the Human Rights Code, that you cannot be discriminated against based on your political beliefs. You can't be discriminated against based on your religion either. So these are things that we as a society protect, and respectful conversations about religion or respectful conversations about political belief are fine at work. But when you cross the line and you're belittling someone, or you're, treating them negatively, political belief is one of the aspects that is actually can be the basis for a human rights complaint. And of course, race. There's lots of information in the news now about how the pandemic has impacted different racial groups much more severely than others. We're hearing and reading lots of stories about anti-Asian discrimination and harassment, and so those, I would say, are all sort of coming to the forefront. And my theory is a lot of that is because of this underlying insecurity that people are lashing out against others. And then bullying and harassment, and we're going to talk about that a lot in this session today. But what do people do when they feel threatened? Sometimes they take that out on other people around them, like controlling behavior, venting, frustration, power hoarding, activities like that would lead to bullying and harassing kind of conduct. I think we are and are going to continue to see more of that over the coming, probably years, as the economic conditions take time to improve.
So how we communicate is changed so much. You don't have a lot of the in-office meetings in person anymore. Remote work has changed everything. Are there new pitfalls that people can sort of slip into?
Yeah, I think that the sort of combination of all the stress and uncertainty, together with the fact that we're all kind of, many of us, not everyone, but many of us are sort of blown in the wind to our living rooms or guest rooms, scattered, it really creates a really unique kind of challenge for communications. There was always water cooler chat, and we think about where we might be, talking about the Donald Trump or whatever it is, the topic of the day, right? Or we're talking about like kids going back to school and how we're feeling about that. And, those discussions, when they're face to face, are a lot easier to read how the other person's reacting and responding to that, as opposed to electronic communication. So now the water cooler is WhatsApp or Slack or Zoom, and Zoom video is better, but it's still not perfect, and it's really hard to read where how people are responding to things other people are saying. And of course, electronic communication can easily be misread for tone, so things that might have been intended one way might be taken for another. So I think there's more potential for disrespectful communications, or communications breakdowns, I guess would be maybe the better term. And at the same time, it's very hard when you're the boss to monitor that. Because at the water cooler, at least you can kind of keep an ear out, or maybe you sense that there's some tension and you're like, oh, I'm going to make sure I'm sort of present when these people are interacting, or, people are probably more likely to be more careful about how they're communicating when they know others could see or hear them. But when you're the boss and you're in your dining room and everybody else is in their dining rooms, or you can't monitor how people are talking to each other because you're not part of that communication. And I think in this time more than ever, bystanders are the key, because bystanders are anyone who hears of disrespectful communication at work. And we need more than ever everybody to be engaged in understanding what's okay, what's not okay, feeling confident to raise issues, maybe in the moment at the time, like, hey, you know what, when you said, I think all the parents just don't want to come to work. I don't think it's really about their kids not, feeling safe at school. Look at all the stuff they've done to make them feel safe. I think parents are just lazy. And I am a parent, so I feel like I'm, putting that on myself. That would be a very disrespectful comment to someone. And maybe I'm talking to you, Colleen, and I don't know if you're a parent or not. And maybe you are and you're offended. Maybe you're not and you're offended. Maybe you hear me say it to someone else and you know that that person is offended. So bystanders are really key because we need as many feelers out there as we can possibly get. And I think the thing to think about is, what would your team do? Like when you think about the people that work in your organization, either beside you or above you, it's like, if someone made a comment like that, just as that example is, what would they do? Would they just, feel uncomfortable, say nothing, move on, or would they do something about it or say something about it? And I think that's remote work is really made that more important.
No, I agree. What about Worksafe BC requirements? What are employers required to do about respect at work? And I don't think this has changed so much for the pandemic. This has
not changed in the pandemic. You are totally right about that. But I think what has changed is Worksafe is on every business's mind who during the pandemic, because of course we all have to have our COVID safety plans and make sure that we're taking the appropriate precautions. So Worksafe generally is top of mind, but mostly people are thinking about COVID and are we cleaning our cleaning protocols. But one thing that Worksafe has required for a very long time, Colleen's right, is that every employer has to have a bullying and harassment policy, and every employer must provide training on bullying and harassment. And if you are an employer listening to this and you just, spilled your coffee because you realize you don't have these things, it's one reason people don't go to webinars, I think. They're like, what? I didn't know I needed to do that. It's not too late. Worksafe has some really good information on their website. If you just go to Worksafe and put bullying and harassment in, there's like a whole organized section on that will help you understand what you need to do. Employment lawyers like me can also help you, but you can definitely get help from from Worksafe as well on those things. What is bullying and harassment? What I thought was a good sort of thing just to plug in here. And this is not my definition. This is Worksafe's definition. And the Worksafe's definition is a worker is bullied and harassed when someone takes an action that he or she knew or reasonably ought to have known would cause that worker to be humiliated or intimidated. So bullying and harassment doesn't have to be intentional. I think that's an important point. So like my sort of example of the comments about working parents, motivation, I may not have intended that to be hurtful or intimidating or humiliating, but I probably ought to have known that. Like I should have known that wasn't okay. And so it can be something that's meant as a joke. It can be something that's meant as a, observation or a comment that wasn't intended to humiliate or intimidate anyone. But if it had that effect, and if I probably should have known that it would have, it's still bullying and harassment. Clear as mud, Colleen?
Yes, making a statement, then following up with, oh, but that's not how I meant it, is not the fix.
Yes, it was a joke. That's one I hear a lot, right? Like
Yeah.
it wasn't, I didn't mean to make that person feel bad. But if you should have known, then, you know, that's something that you're still going to be responsible for.
So what are some of the best practices for supporting a respectful workplace that you've come across?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So we've spent a lot of time, I feel like, on the doom and gloom, like it's all awful and we're all stressed out and saying horrible things to each other, and it's going to land you in hot water with Worksafe BC or at the Human Rights Tribunal. So what can we do to you know, be proactive here? And there are some things we can do. And the good news is the first two things you're actually legally required to do by Worksafe. So you'll be both checking the box and being compliant and also being proactive. So that's always good when you can meet a few goals. So respectful workplace policy is a really good starting place. You know, they do have a template policy on Worksafe BC's website when you can download. You know, in my view, you are much better to either work on a policy based on that or get some help doing that from an HR consultant or from an employment lawyer, to make something that's readable and practical. One sort of red flag that I'll give that I see a lot is people download the policy and sometimes they don't even fill in the blanks, or maybe they've downloaded a policy from somewhere else, like it's not even Worksafe, it's like a policy from the internet somewhere, and it'll say something like, you know, it'll be maybe the Greater Langley Chamber's policy, and it'll say, if you have a complaint, go to the director of HR. And I'm guessing you don't have a director of HR, because when you're a small organization, you usually don't. And so, you know, right away, when people read that policy, they feel confused, like this doesn't apply to me. And they just, it really loses credibility and impact. So like, it's an easy thing to do. And what I really recommend is like you maybe even give it to one of your staff that hasn't worked on it to read and give you feedback on, like, can you understand this? Does it make sense? Is there anything in here that doesn't work? Or as I said, get some help on that, but the focus should be readable and practical. Respectful workplace training is the next thing. And respectful workplace training is something that you're, again, required to do by Worksafe. And you'll notice I'm using different terms here. So bullying, harassment is the terms that Worksafe uses. I use respectful workplace, which is the same thing. It's going to cover the same topics. It's just a much more positive way. When I started practicing law, we used to call them harassment policies. And then we started calling them anti-harassment policies. And to me, this is just the next evolution, is like, no, this is like a respectful workplace policy. Let's not talk about what we don't want. Let's talk about what we do want. So the respectful workplace training is something that will satisfy your requirement under Worksafe to do training on your policy. So make sure people understand it. And the best practice is to include bystander training. There is a lot of research that has been done in the US. I found this really fascinating when I started reading it. In the US, in many states, harassment training has actually been legally mandated for decades. So, you know, in BC, I think we're probably 5 years in. In the US, it's been, you know, many, many decades of harassment training and harassment policies. And so the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the States did a longitudinal study. It was massive, and found no evidence that the training was effective, like full stop. So all these organizations for all these decades are doing this training, and there's nothing that shows that it's effective. And of course, if we watch the media and sort of live our lives, we can see how much of a difference that's made. So that was in 2016, and it really sparked a lot of drive to like, look at how can we make harassment training work? Like, it's an important thing to do, but how can we actually make it work? And bystander training was one of the best practices that came out. And the philosophy was traditional harassment training is mostly about, like, most of us who've worked for a large company have probably sat through harassment training. And it's usually like, don't harass people, it's bad. Like if you're harassing people, stop. If you are being harassed, speak up or come make a report. And also you might get fired if you harass people. It's like not an environment where people are feeling comfortable asking questions. And also targeted really to two people, the person who's doing the harassment and the person who is the victim. And so even though harassment is super widespread in our society, it's still only a small percentage of people that are either being harassed or doing the harassing. And so everyone else is sitting there saying, well, like, this is irrelevant to me. Like one review I remember hearing, not of my own training, thank goodness, but was like, that's 2 hours of my life I'm never going to get back. Like it was just a waste of time, right? So bystander training gives everyone skills so that if they're in that situation where they see something, so they're not the person doing it, they're not the person receiving it, they're the person observing it, what can you do? And how silence is essentially condoning the behavior. And but how can you speak up? Because we've all been trained to be like, that's none of my business, right? So that's just a bit about bystander training. Leading from the top is the next slide. So if you did all the respectful workplace stuff, check, and all the training, check, and then your leadership is bullying and harassing people at work or being disrespectful, it does, like what you've just done doesn't matter, right? Because that's where the standard is being set and that's where the expectations are being set. So leaders need to demonstrate respect. And when I conduct training with our Stand Up Teens program, I strongly recommend that everybody attend the training from top to bottom, every single person. So if someone's working in the mailroom and the CEO and everyone in between, so that we're all operating off the same shared set of expectations, because interactions as people spans everybody. It's a commonality.
Doesn't matter if your title, we're all included in that. So
yeah, we're all people who communicate with each other. Go ahead.
Sorry, Sarah, one of the questions that we got sort of files right into that topic, so just thought I could bump into them a bit. Are there any materials or courses for employees or leadership team members that you would recommend around this topic?
Yeah, I mean, there are just like so much, it's hard to know where to start. And I think, frankly, that's probably a bit of the problem for people. And there's also so many aspects to respectful workplace. Like a lot of people now are talking about, bias and diversity and inclusion. And so, I would say, think broadly, find topics that interest you. In terms of like a materials and, course list, I can tell you on our Stand Up Teams LinkedIn, we are sharing out things we find all the time. And so if you look us up on LinkedIn and follow us, you'll definitely you could look at our past posts, you'll have a good list of different papers and different things that different people have written. And of course, I would be remiss not to plug our own training, which is Stand Up Teams, which is not specific to management. It's, like I said, it's meant to be sort of a universal training, but it would include management as well. And what I do when we're building out the training is I work really closely with HR or the management team to develop it. So it's customized. And in doing that, I'm sort of teaching the leaders first, so that when they're sitting in the training, they're also not hearing all of it for the first time beside everyone. They sort of have an idea of where it's going, and so they can be comfortable kind of participating in a leadership manner during those training courses.
Great.
And the last point I have is continuity. So, I mean, how many times, Colleen, have you gone to a like really amazing conference and been like on time management or something like that, right? Where you're like, oh, this is going to change my life. This is so great. And you're listening, and maybe you're even taking a few notes, and then you go back and you're like, oh, I have 100 emails I missed, and you carry on. And then what you learned in the training is just, if you're lucky, maybe one or two things stick, but mostly it's just one and done, right? So very rarely is any kind of learning one and done. It has to be continuous. So if you get everyone to go to the workplace, respectful workplace training, check, and then they come back to their 100 emails and carry on, and it's never talked about again, it's not going to be nearly as effective. And so what we recommend is including the topic in smaller team meetings, you know, in your newsletters. And so making it something that is referenced throughout your organizational communications. You know, I think that was one of the questions that came in, Colleen, was on that topic. I can't remember exactly what it is. You have it in front of you?
I was going to lead into it next. These
Perfect.
questions kind of fit right into this page well. It said, do you recommend any small blasts of information for employees or managers that could be helpful to ensure that this is a collaborative approach? And that's, you know, I think that's key. It's collaboration so that everybody feels that they're a part of it.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with continuity as well, right? If you get me to come in and do your training and then leave, it's like I'm not in your workplace after that, and I'm not there to be able to make sure that it gets integrated. And so what I do is I work with my clients to make a plan, like that's part of the package of like how they're going to make sure these things stay part of the dialogue. So I'll help them build an agenda for team meetings. In terms like working groups to say, okay, like let's talk about the training and like what we learned and what, you know, is there anything anybody's concerned about, and you know, how can we make sure that we're checking in on respect as we go forward. So that's you know, I think the small blast is exactly right. I think you need it sort of a big blast to get everybody rolling, but then you need to have it be continuous after that.
And one suggestion I have is for what you just mentioned about your LinkedIn group. If people are looking for some information on those small blasts and ideas to get out to the team, that might be a great place to steal some from. Or
yeah, steal away. That's what social media is all about, right?
R&D, rob and duplicate.
Yeah, I definitely, it's very efficient. That's what I like to think. And, you know, most of the time I'm sharing things that other people have written on there, you know, which is, you know, people like it when you do that because it gets more readership for their articles or papers or whatever it is. But it also, you're right, it might be something that you could, you know, if you were looking for something to put in your newsletter once a month, you could probably find something on there that would be interesting to write about or include or offer to people to read. I have a little more about bystander training that I just wanted to sort of run through here because it's a concept that most people aren't familiar with. I find like it's not a new idea. I would say it's increasing in its, like, I guess, public awareness of bystander training and bystander intervention is increasing, but it's still not really something that a lot of people know what it is. So I thought I'd just kind of run through it a bit, and I referenced that in the last slide, but it's basically training that gives everyone at work the skills to identify bullying and harassment, because that's step one for being a bystander, is like feeling confident to understand what's okay and what's not okay. Because if you're not sure about that, you're sure not going to say something.
No.
And then two is, okay, I know that was offside. Now what can I do about it? And so giving people the confidence and the skills to see something, say something. So that's not my phrase. That's a phrase that's used all over the place for bystanders. And, you know, I see it coming up at school a lot for the kids for many years. It's been talked about. Is like, when you see something, say something, you know, don't be silent about it. And that I would say the new language that's just starting to be used now is also around allyship and being an ally. And that's another word that a lot of people don't really know what it means, and maybe it feels a bit uncomfortable. But a bystander and an ally are kind of almost on two ends of the spectrum, where a silent bystander does nothing. And if that person then takes action, they become an ally because they're taking action to support their colleague. I've thrown up here just a few examples of, you know, the kinds of things that bystanders can do to be an ally and to support their coworkers. What I always say about bystander interventions is, like, there's really no like set list. I can't give you an everything you can do. The exercise is, okay, silence, do nothing is one response that we're trying to move off of. Doing anything else is doing something, right? So we're trying to get people out of the do nothing to like something. And, you know, what that something is going to be is going to depend on who that person is, how comfortable and confident they feel, how safe that situation is. And there's no one size fits all. So some of the ones I have on here are, you know, distract. So this is one we often talk about, is like make a joke, change the subject. Like, you know, maybe I see someone talking to Colleen in a disrespectful way at an event, and maybe they're like standing too close to her, it looks like maybe, and she's kind of like leaning away, and maybe she gives me the like eyes, right? and maybe I can go over there and say, hey, Colleen, I want to introduce you to someone over here. And I've just distracted from that. Now I haven't called it out, you know, I haven't made anyone else feel uncomfortable probably, but I've just, you know, distracted and sort of change the subject, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I come in and join the conversation, right? And so that's one, you know, one example. Support. So I'm just going to keep using you as my victim, Colleen. So, and I think this, like at an event, like it seems like I guess it's not very COVID-y, but like it is definitely something that happens, would happen in other times. So another thing I could do is I don't feel comfortable approaching Colleen. I feel like maybe coming in and pulling her away is kind of rude, and I don't actually have anyone I need to introduce her to. So I don't want to do that. But maybe I run into Colleen later that evening and I say, hey, like I noticed that guy was standing really close to you. Like, were you okay with that? Like, do you know him? And then that lets you say like, hey, yeah, actually that was my boyfriend, right? Or, oh my gosh, every event I've been at for the last year, that guy's been there. He never leaves me alone. And I just like, don't want to do, and I'm thinking about quitting because I just can't handle it anymore. And like what we're going to do next is going to be very different on that conversation, but I've taken a step beyond silence to start that conversation with you. Follow up is another one. So maybe I know the guy who's close talking with you, and I can talk to him later and say, hey, you know what? I noticed you talking to Colleen. Just, you might not have seen it, but she looked a bit uncomfortable, how close you were standing, and you just might want to give people a little more personal space. You know, so that would be another way that I could take action. Direct. So this is the like guns blazing approach, right? So, you know, that's when you're calling it out, right? So I'm approaching and I'm saying like, you know, hey, like you're kind of right on top of Colleen there, like what's going on? Or that's not okay, or, you know, you're making her feel uncomfortable, and maybe I'm calling it out at the moment. You know, that doesn't feel that good in the example that I gave, but in a workplace where you're all working together all the time, it might be something that's more appropriate, right?
Yeah.
Like the working parent example I gave, where I said I thought all working parents were just lazy. Like Colleen might say, hey, you know what? Like there's a lot of working parents here, and it's actually a really hard time for them. And what you said is that's pretty offensive. And like maybe we have a safe place where you can call that out right in the moment, right? Record. So this is something that maybe if you don't feel like, maybe it's you and you're just a person who doesn't feel comfortable speaking out, or you don't know the people that involved that well, or it's kind of minor and you're not sure, you can record it. So you can make a note, make a date, what was said, who was present. And, you know, as a lawyer, I love this stuff, right? It's so often, like in a human rights complaint, for instance, you literally have to put, there's like 2 columns, date and incident. And, you know, we're going back saying, oh, do you remember, Colleen, when that was? And you're like, maybe it was January, or I don't know, it could have been March, and who was there and what exactly was it that was said. And so if you have a record, even as a bystander, when if it's happening repeatedly, then maybe you need to move on to one of these other elements. Or I know that the person is making a complaint, and I say, hey, like, I actually have some information here that might be helpful for you, right?
Yeah.
And then the last one I have on here, and again, this isn't exhaustive, is report. So, you can make a report, and that's part of what would be in your respectful workplace or your bullying and harassment policy, is how to make a report and who to go to. So I often get people say, well, if we're talking about bystanders, like, are you going to give us all whistles and make us all referees? Like, we're all going to have to rat everybody out every time someone says something on offside. Well, the only thing in here where you're bringing this up with management is the report. Like, there's lots of things you can do that aren't that. And it just, again, just completely depends on the circumstances.
But I think too, it's getting away from that whole rat fink concept. It's not ratting anybody out. If somebody has made somebody else in the group feel really uncomfortable or out of place, or made that really offside comment, to them it's not offside, but they need to be informed that it was. And I think that's, I mean, historically in business, it's, oh, if you have a problem, report it to HR, not my problem, like a management might say. Nowadays, I think it's much more important that you're engaged and you understand and know. And knowing your team helps too. You can kind of know from there people's circumstances and know what something might offend somebody, even though nobody else will, you know?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, so those are just some, again, just like a little sampler of bystander training, so people can kind of get a sense of what it's about and how we can help people. And it can seem very intimidating to move off that it's none of my business. And so understanding, like, it doesn't have to be a big thing, but it really does have to be something.
Yeah.
So I made a little scenario up, because this is a big part of what bystander training is sort of going through scenarios. And I tried to pick something that is not based on any true facts, just to be clear. This is not a case on my desk right now, but is like, are things that are happening out there in the world, sort of relating to the pandemic and dealing with bystanders. And so, here's my example. So you're at work, you're in person, you're in retail. So you have one of those jobs where everybody needs to come to work and be there in person. One of your colleagues comes up, this is the middle of the shift, and she says, hey, you know what? I've got a sore throat and I need to leave and go get a COVID test. And so there's a few people that are kind of standing around, and you're looking at her, and she doesn't look sick, and she's been at work for half the shift, and you're already short, and you're going to be even more short-staffed. So everybody's kind of like ready to blow, right? And so one of your coworkers says to her as she walks out, just so you know, this will be a total you-know-what show. Thanks for nothing. And you overhear, and a few of your other colleagues overhears. So, the it's none of my business school would say, well, this is none of your business. Don't say anything, don't do anything, go back, do your work, right? But what could you do? And these are the kinds of scenarios we'll work through generally in small groups. Today, we've really got Colleen and I, so we're going to be a very small group. And we just creatively share ideas, and there are no wrong answers to this.
I mean, in my situation, it would be very clear that as soon as somebody has symptoms, they are to leave. If they've already been around the bubble, so if they've been in office and around the bubble, the office gets closed until the test result comes back indefinitely. That's just how we're operating. That's our COVID policy right now. So if you happen to have not been in the office the day of this occurrence and not having come into contact with that person, you might be the only one here running the office by yourself for the next couple of days. But until with that comment, I personally would take, after the person left to go to their test, I would take the person who made the comment aside and say, I get that you're frustrated, and I get that I get it. Everybody's feeling this way, but that was really uncalled for.
Yeah. So that's the follow-up, right? So you're following up with a person, you're not doing anything in the time, and you're making your point. So you're doing something. Yeah. I think another option, I always love to just go direct. And sometimes it's like, it's kind of fun in bystander training to try something out that maybe you would never do. Like, it doesn't actually have to be something you would do. It's like, okay, well, what could a person do? So someone like you, if you heard this is all unfolding around you, you could just say that in the moment, right? You could be like, look, we're in a pandemic, and let's call her Susie, like Susie going home is actually taking care of all of us. And what you're saying right now is making her feel badly for that, which isn't okay.
Yeah.
You know, the value of saying it in the time is Susie hears that.
Yeah.
Right. You know, again, may not be knowing the players, knowing how everyone feels safe, may not be okay. You know, another option would be follow up with Susie.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe you're calling Susie at home that night and saying, hey, you know what, like when Bob said that, it was really uncalled for. And, you know, I just want to make sure you're okay. Yeah. Is there anything you want me to do? You know, and maybe like in your example, Colleen, maybe you're like, you know what, and I talked to Bob after and I told him I didn't think that was okay. So she knows that, you know, she's got something.
So we do have a couple of questions popping up in chat.
Sure. Yeah. So you can kind of, that I think gives us a little bit of a sense, but you know, you can get really creative on these things, and you know, in an actual training scenario, we would spend a lot of time talking about what people do. And one thing I really find is it is a really good team building exercise as well, because you really see how caring your coworkers are and sort of the lengths to which they might be willing to go to back you up. And I think it sets the stage for those kinds of things to be successful. So yeah, let's go to questions. I love it.
So what about the accent of speaking? Does it fall under harassment and bullying if someone comments about it?
That's a great question. I often use a scenario around accent in my training. And here's the scenario I use. I say, you have a coworker who speaks with an accent. One of your other coworkers is really good at imitations. And so he does a perfect imitation of this person's accent, but he only does it when the person's not around, and he does it to get laughs. So everybody laughs because he's doing his great impersonation, right? And you start to notice this and you feel uncomfortable, and then you are in a meeting or like maybe you're in the coffee room and it happens again. You know, what do you say something like, is that okay? Is that not okay? So I think the question of accent is, you know, that it's, you know, there might be ways to have respectful discussions about it. There might be actual work-related, like some work-related connection, but I think it's definitely, you're treading on dangerous ground. And certainly, like if we go back to the definition, if it's humiliating or intimidating, and then, you know, that's going to be bullying and harassment. And I think my example probably is.
Yeah.
Right. So as opposed to maybe like someone says something and you don't understand them and you say, hey, do you mind repeating that a little more slowly? I'm having trouble understanding you with your accent, in a respectful one-time way, right? Maybe that's not. Accent is also connected with human rights grounds of place of origin and race. And so there are some issues potentially there as well. So it's definitely a like proceed with extreme caution, I would say, topic.
Okay. And the other question was, what about informicent? I'm not sure if that's a word or if that's a spelling error. I'm sorry, Shisha. But yeah, it says, what about informicent?
So, I don't know what that word doesn't mean anything to me.
Yeah.
So without a little more context, that
I'm wondering if it's informed consent, maybe. But if she wants to type in there a little bit more, I couldn't clarify, but you didn't write it? Okay, came up underneath there, sorry. Or it's
That's okay.
That's okay.
Oh, webinar challenges, there's always one, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
that's great. Well, are there any other questions, Colleen? Or are we?
No, I think we've covered off on all of them. Sarah, thank you very much again for sharing your knowledge with our members. We really appreciate it. And again, if anybody's looking for more information, I'm probably going to hit up the LinkedIn group there and
Yeah,
check it out.
follow us on LinkedIn. You'll see the kinds of things we're putting out and talking about. And we have a website as well called standupteams.ca. And I'm also super happy to chat with anyone and give them more information, because it's something I'm super passionate about. And for all the reasons we discussed, I think is really needed right now in terms of a place for people to pay attention.
Well, I think you've touched on a lot of topics that makes a lot of people think about how, how we move forward in this landscape. And I think, unfortunately, with possible, well, we're talking about second wave, depending on where you are in the country, kind of amping up, there's also that possibility and that uncertainty that comes down with it. And again, everybody's worried about the future. And
Yeah.
so without, I think we'll see more and more people needing training and support moving forward.
One of the most interesting things I've seen on social media recently, sort of in this topic area, was someone suggesting that we need to approach other people at work with radical generosity at this time. And I often say, I've been saying for a long time, like, we all need flexibility. And I remember the first time I started using that word, it's laughable now, but remember we had all those snow days, and it was like 3 days where we couldn't send our kids to school, and everyone was like, am I going to get fired? Like, what's going to happen? And I did a lot of media interviews, and I said, this is like Mother Nature has intervened here. This is out of everyone's control, and everyone just needs to be flexible on both sides. And usually there's something that's workable if everybody is flexible. And I think this pandemic has obviously just, blown all of that worry about snow days out of the water. But I think it's the same approach, is like flexibility. Everybody needs to be flexible, and it's amazing how flexible, all the flexibility we've seen and the generosity we've seen too.
Definitely. And I mean, just reminding people to be kind. Be kind, and Bonnie Henry nails it,
Every time. I'm not even going to try it because I can't, I won't, I don't want to, I don't want to even.
Calm, be safe.
Yeah, let's do it. So great to talk to you, Colleen. Thank you, Greater Langley Chamber, for having me and, having us as a member, and all the good work you're doing on behalf of the members.
Great. Thank you very much, sir. We'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.